questions now that we don't have much time from the room. I see a hand over here. I know Denmark's radio is here, but representing other Scandinavian media. So I please will go to Denmark's radio first.
Ms. Damsbo, can you please explain how important is the building Børsen to Copenhagen in Denmark?
Yes, that would be my privilege. The Stock Exchange of Copenhagen is one of the most iconic and historical buildings of Copenhagen. Actually, this year, which was supposed to be the 400th anniversary of the building, it opens its doors with the first small shops in 1624. So this year was actually supposed to be a celebratory year for the Stock Exchange. The building was ordered by the very famous King Christian IV of Denmark in the early 17th century. Christian IV is known as sort of the building king of Denmark, and he ordered several historical buildings that are standing here in Copenhagen to this day. Among them, the very famous, the celebrated Round Tower, which is just actually, I assume you can see it from outside the windows in this room we're in, and also Rosenborg Castle, which was his own private, actually, castle building presently in the King's Garden. The same architect, Hans van Steenwinkel, was from Holland, so these buildings are all prime examples of sort of the Dutch Renaissance style here in Copenhagen. Van Steenwinkel also designed the famous castle, Frederiksborg Castle, in northern Zealand, about 40 kilometers from Copenhagen. But the building, the Børsen building, was particularly famous because it is still to this day an expression of the king's vision of a global trading city. He wanted basically to transform Copenhagen, which was sort of a regional city in these times of history. He wanted to transform Copenhagen into sort of a global trading hub. And the stock exchange was supposed to be exactly a building for that, a building for trading goods from all across the globe. And we have many sources from history of princesses and kings and queens touching silk from the Far East, smelling spices back in the 1700s. And it's this particular sense of internationalism that this building carries with it.
And just a quick question more. When you first heard that it was a fire, you have seen the pictures now, half of the building is supposed to be destroyed. That's what we hear. What is your thoughts? How much a loss is this?
It's still new to us all, but it's a huge loss. I actually can't really put words on that because it's very emotional for all of us. I really do believe this is like a building that carries much of sort of national identity and national feeling. So it really is like a hugely emotional moment. Perhaps especially for us historians, I'm not sure, but terrible.
Samuel from Swedish Radio. There has been a lot of talks today about saved artifacts, paintings and other stuff that were evacuated during the early stages of the fire. But much is also lost, I have understood. Do you have any, approximation of monetary value of how much artifacts and historical art that has been lost today? Except the house itself, of course.
Yeah, well, I think first of all, it's important to remind ourselves that no lives were lost. So at least it's. Of course, I think we all agree on that the building itself is by far the most important cultural artifact that's perhaps been lost today. I really hope that there's a possibility for reconstruction. I really sincerely hope that. There's one painting that I know from just the press coverage this morning have been saved, which is iconic for the building, and it's a painting by the famous Danish painter Krøyer, P.S. Krøyer, who in 1895 painted this big portrait of 50 industrial magnets from the stock exchange at the time. And it's a painting that's very much iconic for the building and iconic for the time, also the historical era. And luckily that painting was saved. Apparently, at the time in the late 1900s, as an industrialist, you would actually pay for your place in that particular painting. So all of the 50 men are all, I want to make a note on that in a minute, are all known by name. And so it's really a historical document that tells a lot about not only Denmark at this time and age, but also of industrialism and capitalism, not least. But I have no idea of the amount of value other than this that has been lost in the fire. But it's clear that there's a lot of furniture, a lot of furnishings, a lot of that are priceless in any way. They will not be. They cannot be replaced in any case. But there's another artwork that is not a material artwork that is linked to the stock exchange, and that is a much more contemporary artwork. It was created as a performance in 1969 by Lene Adler Petersen, a Danish artist, and she did a very famous performance at the stock exchange where she paraded naked through the main hall of the stock exchange with a crucifix, and the artwork was called Female Christ. And I think, this artwork is a very famous artwork in Danish, the modern canon of Danish art history, and it is very much a sort of a comment on capitalism, of male dominance, and so forth and so forth. So it's also like, I feel that we very much celebrate the history of the stock exchange, and this is still on a celebratory note, but I also feel that it's important to add the fact that it's also a building that carries with it a very specific history of capitalism and perhaps of male dominance, and there has been a lot of that has been contested and questioned with a performance like this. So just to say that it's also a building with more than one connotation, or more than one story at least.
As I know, it's of course difficult for you at this stage to provide an overview, but we also got Reuters with us online, and they're asking a little, I don't know how much you know, but of course you talked about the artifacts. Apart from the famous painting being saved and the value of money, do you have any kind of idea? Are we looking at 50% or less or more? I mean, have you got any idea how the rescue operation has been conducted?
What I've been able to get in terms of information by now is that it's mainly the hearth part of the building, the sort of front part of the building that is mostly destroyed, and the sort of back part of the building that is perhaps slightly less damaged. But it seems clear that the damages are very, very severe to the building.
Thank you. We'll now go to Copenhagen Post.
Christopher from the Copenhagen Post. The stock exchange is placed in one of the most historical significant parts of the city. Has there been any word of damage on the other historical buildings like Christiansborg or the old Arsenal?
No. Fortunately, the only building that's been touched is the stock exchange itself. When at the palace, at Christiansborg Palace, when we are particularly perhaps involved in this, if you could put it this way, in this disaster, is because the palace itself has burned at two occasions throughout these last a couple of hundred years. The first time was in 1794, and the second time 90 years later. And in both cases, actually, a number of artworks were rescued, and some of them we have installed. They were installed. It's not us who did it, but they're installed at the current Christiansborg Palace, and you can see historical artworks that actually was damaged in the fire more than 200 years ago. Some of them actually slightly. They have a damage because of the smoke, and I think. Well, just to say that it's a sad history, but there is a history of historical buildings burning being destroyed in fires, obviously like in any country. And it's very much also the history of Christiansborg Palace. And that history is somehow recorded in the artworks that were saved throughout the centuries. And obviously this incident will also be recorded in art in terms of artworks being saved. I'm sure some of them will have damages as well. So the incident is, I mean, in a weirdly, of course, in a mostly sad way, but also in a weirdly, I don't know, there's something about a disaster event like this almost being recorded into the artworks, and they live on, which I find somehow in a rather dark way slightly poetic even. It's somehow surviving disasters, artwork surviving disasters. That is a little bit like, there's something slightly, at least we have that sort of, you know what I'm trying to,
Thank you, Mads. We have another question coming in a minute. If you could, for the sake of our online audience, try to direct your answer over here. I know it's difficult when somebody else asks the question. That would be very helpful. Thank you. But otherwise...
Thank you. My name is Dirk Evers. I'm from Belgium. I'm a freelancer. First of all, I would like to correct you because the von Steenwinkels were not from Holland. They came from Antwerp. Yeah. So
forgive me.
If you say the Netherlands, that's fine, but it's... how the hell can this happen? I mean... What is your thought about that? I know perhaps you're not allowed to speak about it, but no precautions, no routines? How? I mean, because Christiansborg has been burned out twice. This has never been burned down, this building, so how can this happen? What are your thoughts?
My thoughts on this specific question is that obviously there will be an investigation in this. There are regulations, there are routines, there are inspections, I think, how could it happen at the Notre Dame in Paris 5 years ago? I think certain historical buildings, almost entirely built of wood, are just incredibly fragile. And I think it's one of those things that are just actually difficult to 100% protect yourself against. I cannot really answer the security of buildings as is the responsibility of the ministry. But I'm sure they're asking themselves the same question: how on earth could this happen? But I think, despite of all the measurements one can take, there's always this element of risk and chance and bad luck, perhaps. So I cannot provide a more specific answer than that.
Thank you, Mads. Any more questions from the room?
Perhaps I should add just one note that it's a 400 years old building, very much, I mean, the majority of it made of wood is just a terribly fragile structure. It's just one of, So I mean, we had an incident at the palace about 30 years ago when the church were severely damaged due to a fire because of a carnival fireworks that just landed on the roof and the roof caught fire through that. So it's also, you live in the very center of a capital city. Things just can happen. I think you can never protect yourself 100%.
Thank you. And again, for the people joining us on Zoom, you're welcome to still write your couple of questions in the chat. We've got the Financial Times online, and you talked a little bit about it, but could you say a little bit more about the construction of the building, the wooden beams, the roof? How has the fact that it is what it is affected the fire today?
First of all, you have to imagine a building constructed on a tiny island, which is like this, the palace grounds in Copenhagen. It's a ground that is, it's 800 years of Danish history. Basically, this tiny island, Copenhagen grew up, I could say, maybe in English. It sort of grew steadily around this tiny island. Back in the 12th century, it was a small fortress. And it's during the course of history that the city of Copenhagen slowly have grown around this spot. The stock exchange was built as directly onto the canal in order for ships to be able to unload goods. It was built right up to the royal palace at the time, the Copenhagen Castle, and still at the time when the Copenhagen Castle was there, on the same spot as where we currently have our Christiansborg Palace, there was a water sort of fence around the castle. It was all very medieval. And as you all know, I mean, back in the days, in the medieval times and Renaissance times, you would build buildings mainly in wood, obviously, and in stone, but all the roof constructions, was all made in wood. It's not a particularly tall building. It's a relatively low building, actually, with a huge roof, which is made in, I believe, in copper. That itself makes the building vulnerable to fire, because actually the fire stays underneath the roof. The firemen couldn't get into the fire, actually. They could only try and combat the fire through the windows, but they're not hugely big. And everything inside the building is obviously wood, so it's like a little bit like having an oven going on with a fire inside it. And that's one of the reasons why the fire got so violent during the day, because they couldn't really get to the fire, actually. It was almost protected by the ceiling, actually, or sort of boxed in by the ceiling. So you can almost put together the pieces by yourself, that mainly wooden construction covered by a huge copper roof in a fairly low structure. It's just, that's very fragile.
Thank you. Any more questions from the room? Doesn't seem to be the case. I think we'll just call out the last time for online. Other than that, Mads, I think, what do you think, what's going to happen tomorrow? I mean, what's on your agenda in terms of taking this forward? I know it's not your building, but what do you anticipate is the next step for people in positions like yourself?
I think what will happen next is a sort of overview, what was actually lost, what was actually saved, what's the state of what's remaining of the building, what can be reconstructed, what will be. So there are a lot of questions, not just tomorrow, but during these coming weeks and months, I imagine.
There doesn't seem to be any more questions, so thanks a lot. So with that, I think we'll wrap it up here and say thank you, Mads.
You're very welcome. Thank you.